I'd like to officially welcome you to today's webinar on how to create a flexible strategy for 2021. 5 steps to a winning plan for uncertain times. We genuinely appreciate you logging on, and we definitely understand that everyone is facing unprecedented times right now, and we hope that this moment that we spend together will be a time that will help you accomplish more flexible strategizing for your business. We are here today with an incredible group of experts to share with you some incredible insight. And in addition to the presentation, we will also open up Q&A at the end. If you'd like to stay an extra few minutes and just talk with the LDI experts, I can change the settings so that they can hear you and you can ask your questions or dialogue about any strategy questions that you have that are particular to your situation. In addition, as I mentioned, LDI is providing a free strategy workbook to those who are attending this webinar today, and you will have received that via email just moments before logging on to this webinar. The panelists today will be including some information in reference to that workbook. So if you'd like to pull up the workbook and refer to it during the session, that may be helpful for you. It's also a tool that is intended to help you after this webinar today as you continue to build your strategy for 2021. I'd like to introduce our panelists to you. You have Tony Bell, who is the founder and CEO of Leader Development, Inc. He's also the author of Great Leadership, The Clock Tower, and Rescuing Healthcare. You also have Mitch Smith, who is the Executive Vice President of Leader Development, Inc. and former tech CEO. Mitch is the author of the book Junk. And myself, Jessica Cabrera. I'm a certified consultant at Leader Development, Inc., and I'll be facilitating today's discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. So Tony, I'll turn it over to you first to give everyone an overview of why we're here today and what we'll be covering.
Thank you, Jessica. And I just want to add my warm welcome too for Mitch and me. We're just really excited to be with you, really looking forward to this, and really believe that you'll find this actually very helpful. And here's actually what we're going to do. We told you there would be 5 steps. So the first one is to help you assess your market and your customers. And that's looking at kind of the bigger context. And then the second step is to take a closer look inside to your organization and see where you are now. And then the third step will be, okay, we've taken a look at ourselves, we've taken a look at our market, let's review where we're heading. And that may be completely upended in this environment. And once we're clarified around the direction that we're going in, then we can map out what it is we need to do in order to get there. That's step 4. And then the 5th one is creating accountability to actually execute it, to make sure that it actually gets done. So those are the 5 steps, and we're really looking forward to unpacking them with you.
Thanks, Tony. We'll get started, and I'll turn it over to Mitch, who will start out with the why. Why is it a necessity to build a strategy for 2021? Mitch?
Thank you, Jessica. And again, welcome everyone. You know, if there's ever been a time when we really need to be thinking very clearly about why we need a strategy in 2021, it's because of the curveball we were thrown this year. And if you look at the information that's currently out there, whether it be from businesses to CEO surveys to CDC reports, whatever it may be, there's a lot of uncertainty still existing in the marketplace. So with that, it makes more reason for you to not only look at setting a strategy, but also making one that's a little bit more flexible than maybe ones you've done in the past, because there are many things that could happen. At a presidential election, and we're still dealing with a pandemic that may resurface as it's kind of arisen in some states. And again, the uncertainty of what's going on. So let's take a look at kind of what you need to be thinking about. You know, when you and your team, now what's key in strategy is having the right people at the meeting and involved in this this time together, whether it be a 2-day offsite, whatever it may look like, is having the right people together. And ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to predict what's going to happen in your market and how your client's going to react. Now, of course, you're going to have your idea of what that may look like because of information you're looking at, but your customers may actually have a different opinion or different idea based on what they're looking at. So when you take a look at what may happen, I mean, could it potentially get worse? Could it stay the same? Or could we potentially get back to normal? I mean, those are really three. I know there's other options that kind of fit in those areas. But if we think about just these three, when you set your strategy, it's not only about what your prediction is, it's about making sure it aligns to what your clients see. So things like surveys, I mean, real conversations with them, with the CFO, with the COO of the company that maybe you're trying to do business with, or taking, surveying your top clients. Because if your strategy doesn't align with them, you're probably going to miss the mark. Now, let's look at the goals. So the real goal for strategy is to be able to set a clear direction for your company. This is imperative for the senior team and specifically the CEO to do, to make sure that they're identifying what that direction looks like. Setting the necessary budget. Do we have the proper resources in place to execute this plan? Aligning the teams. As we know, we saw in the midst of 2020, alignment kind of got shifted because of some remote, some not remote. A lot of those things happen. So getting these teams properly aligned so they continue to know their roles and purpose, and then setting proper key performance KPIs so that you can measure and really determine, are we hitting the mark where we're supposed to be, both in our processes, but also in that of our teams. Now, let's look at a calendar of why it's so important to be here today. APQC has done a lot of research on what they have determined to be the top performing companies. I would equate it to some of the work that Collins did in Good to Great. And what they did is they found that companies that exceeded, that were the top performers, generally followed a strategy similar to what we're talking about today. And that is, one, you're giving the month of October to really be focused on the strategy, doing your research, analyzing your data, and knowing where are we and where can we potentially be going. And once you've done that, once you've kind of set that direction, it then gives proper time to set the right budgets. Now, what they've determined in their top performers, that ironically, top performers were spending less time in budgeting than low performers. So I think, if I remember correctly, I think it was 36 days was generally the average that they were spending within budget. So my hope would be is that at the end of October, you're already moving into your budget cycle. Make sure everyone's got the proper allocation and getting feedback on that. And then next, once you've kind of finished those budgets, now it's time to communicate that down through the ranks and do your alignment and do your planning. And that's where you really spend the month of December, because what you want to make sure that happens is that January 1, the company is starting off in the right direction. Now, let's take a look at a scenario that, ironically, some of my friends face. I've got a few friends that own office furniture supplies. Here we've nicknamed a company, we give a name, ACME Office Furniture. So ACME Office Furniture in 2020 had some amazing things happen, right? So they saw a very large almost 6 months of their clients return home and working remotely. So they probably didn't sell much office furniture in that period of time. And again, if you look at the current statistics that KPMG just put out, there we've got on the screen, we will downsize our office space, allow more employees to work remotely. 68% of CEOs made that statement. So if you're ACME Office Supply and you're going into 2021, you're probably going to need a different strategy and a different plan, a different channel of suppliers, because you're probably, if you're going to continue to serve the corporate market, you're probably going to be serving the corporate market, maybe helping them get the right office equipment, the right ergonomic chairs and stands for their home offices so their employees can be just as effective remote as they were in the office. So again, it's just, there's like one simple example. Restaurants, there's hardly many companies that weren't impacted, unless you're Amazon and Costco and maybe Walmart and Lowe's. You made it well through this, but the other ones are really having to look clearly at what has changed with my customers' needs, what are their problems, and how can what we do help solve that. Now, really it comes down to two things. What's changed for the worse for you? So in this case, we looked at the shift to remote office furniture, and the sales were lagging in 2020. So what's changed for the better? Well, during that period of time, your COO and your supply chain person probably went out and said, hey, let's go find some suppliers for home office furniture for 2021 so we can continue to service our clients' needs. So this is just a simple example. We do have this in your workbook for you to also kind of be making these, filling in these blanks as you go through the next few weeks in your strategy session. Now, we all are very familiar with SWOT. I mean, it's something that has been in most of our business classes, and most of the companies utilize this. But we wanted to provide you this merely as just another reference point. It's just something good to go back to look at, specifically with regard to always being focused where your strengths are. Know what you're good at. You know, think of the hedgehog concept with good to great. You know, that is key. What are you good at? What can you be the best at? But also, what drives your economic engine? And then you've got to survey the market to say, okay, what are those things that are impacting us? And again, I would just say, think books like Blue Ocean Strategy or other books that I think at this time can be helpful as you look at putting in the proper strategy. Now, some questions that you need to answer, and I won't go through all of these because we provide this for you in your workbook. But there are some key questions that you need to be asking yourself. You know, what has changed for the better and worse? What are those things? What are your customers' core needs? What are the problems that they need you to solve for them? And then what makes you unique in the market? So setting those things apart, again, if you read Blue Ocean Strategy, a lot of these things are given as ideas to also think about. But you've got to be continually looking at what are the things that's changed, and then how can we better ourselves going forward. If you've ever read the book Business Model Generation, what you're really doing is you're taking these answers and putting it on a one page. We provided this as the last page of your workbook to kind of fill in, because you know the easiest way for an organization to communicate effectively is to put down as much of what you do as a process in businesses on one piece of paper. Because once you do this, it's easy to see, easy to clarify, easy to know who's responsible for what. So whether it be your key partners, your key resources, your channels of distribution, these are essential to kind of keep in front of you so everybody's reminded how important each part is to the company operating.
Thanks so much, Mitch. That's a great way to set the stage and to get us in the mindset of the process that we need to go through in order to really build this flexible strategy. Now we're going to move to the very own Tony Bell to talk to you about the power of purpose and unfold this topic a little bit more to really look at how to be flexible during this time. Tony?
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Mitch. And a couple of thoughts. If you're tracking with the workbook, then those questions that Mitch just mentioned, they take up several pages, and there's space for you to write in there. And we really encourage you to do that. And so what Mitch has covered is really the first two steps. And now we're on to step number 3, which is reviewing your direction. Now, I would like to emphasize that you may not be the CEO, and I'm not sure if we got how many CEOs are on this webinar, but this is not just, what we're talking about is not just for the CEO. You can be leading a department. You can be leading a service center for transportation, a logistics company. Whatever that is, what we're talking about is really relevant to you. And that sheet that Mitch just pointed out, that's at the end of your workbook, you can use that in whatever environment you're in, because those questions are very, very applicable. So be sure, even though we're in many ways, we're talking about CEOs, we're talking about large companies, but really we're talking about anyone who is leading a part of the organization if not the whole of the organization. And what I want to get into is a really powerful concept about direction. And it's something that I'm sure you've heard of it. I'm sure you're familiar with it. In fact, Jim Collins and Jerry Porras made that very well known and widely spread and widely used when they wrote the book Built to Last. And they talked about purpose, values, and vision. And that kind of is the DNA of an organization. And that really is where we need to start. We need to start with what is the why? Why are we doing what we're doing? And again, this is true if you're leading a service center, a department, a business unit, whatever it is. You need to ask that question for what is our why? And it is interesting that in the light of this pandemic, that many people have actually really been forced to look at what their why is, because the fact is the pandemic really challenged it. And this is really interesting. This is from KPMG. And the CEOs that they surveyed, 79% said that the purpose for their organization created an emotional response. It triggered an emotion for them. And they realized that actually the purpose really is important. And the pandemic really underscored it. And then 79% said that they were forced to reevaluate it. They were forced to ask the question, is our purpose still relevant given these incredibly uncertain and dramatically different times that we're in? And then 77%, and these are all high numbers, we're talking about 3 out of 4 people, 77% said that the pandemic forced them or helped them to really understand what they need to do. It helped them make decisions. It made it easier to make decisions. The clearer their purpose, the easier it was to make a decision. And at the root of a flexible strategy is a real clarity around what is our purpose. And then the last one, the fourth one, 77% said that the purpose really helped them to establish a right response to what was happening with the pandemic. So not just in decision-making in general, but very specifically to that particular crisis. So purpose is really important, but so are values and vision. And these are often confused. How do we, what do we mean by vision? People confuse vision and purpose, and people get muddled on these things. But this really is kind of to help you figure out what it is. So the vehicle is your organization, or it could be your area, it could be your department, whatever it is. You're on that particular road to fulfill a purpose. That's your why. You're on this road and you're not on another one, further west or east or wherever it is. You're on this particular road. And you are going for a point on the horizon. That's your vision. Now, that point on the horizon with a flag on it, that could be the mountain to the right, it could be the mountain to the left, but you have chosen to make it that point. That's where you're heading to. That is your vision. That's where you're going to. It sometimes expressed as a BHAG. It could be, but it also could be expressed very much as a set of goals that are going to get you there. And then what are values? Well, values are these guardrails that when they're strong, you can be tempted to veer off into the field on the left or the field of the right, but those guardrails will bounce you back onto the road, will keep you going straight. And when values are not clear, and there are different kinds of values, and we don't have time to go into that, they're operational values, they're moral values, and so on, but they're work environment values. But when those are not clear, then it gets very fuzzy and murky, and you waste a lot of time because you're wandering around in the field over here or in the field over here, and you've lost sight of the direction that you're in. You need those values to keep you going in the right direction. So that's your purpose, values, and vision. And these are the questions that you really need to be raising. Is your purpose still valid? There's some really good examples. Jessica mentioned this at the beginning. I co-authored a book on leadership in healthcare called Rescuing Healthcare. And we started with the premise that healthcare needs to be really clear on what its purpose is. and it's actually got a misguided purpose. And the purpose that it has been pursuing, really for much of the 20th century into the 21st century, is to cure illness. Now, that sounds like actually a very good purpose, but it's actually a misleading one. And what is becoming clear, and this is the value of the pandemic, is that a much better purpose, and this is what we argued in the book, a much better purpose is not to cure illness, but to prevent it. Now, when you think of healthcare in those terms, it completely changes the dynamics, because now your business model, if you're a hospital, that means if your purpose is to cure illness, you want your beds filled, and if you have an empty one, you're losing money. But if your goal is to prevent illness, your purpose is to empty the hospital. You want to use it for something else. You want to be administering healthcare in a different way. Your purpose really makes a difference. And so your question should be, at this point, with everything that's going on, is your purpose still valid? Now, I bet that in 95% of the cases, maybe 90, whatever it is, your purpose won't change. You're still, for us at LDI, our purpose is still to build up great leaders, build up great organizations. That doesn't change. The circumstances and the way we do that does, but our purpose has not changed. And this would be true if you're leading a department. Your purpose is unlikely to have changed. Or if you're leading a business unit or a service center, whatever it is, your purpose needs to be clear. And that needs to be clear to everyone who's involved with you that you're leading, not just your direct reports, but those who report to them. So next one is clarifying your values. Do you need to rethink these values? Because the pandemic has really challenged them. And I think, one company, AAA Cooper, a great company, very well led, and this is a shout out to anyone from AAA Cooper. The way that AAA Cooper responded to this was very much in line with their values. What they did is, safety is a very high value in this. It's a transportation company, but what they did is, right when it started, they wanted to make sure that everybody was safe. All their decisions were around that. And then not only that, they wanted to make sure that people felt secure in their jobs. And in fact, this is a company that is really unusual in that industry in that it didn't lay anyone off. They wanted people to feel secure in their roles. That's because the value was really strong. And the value was really tested and proven to be really a valid one when the pandemic hit. So your values really do matter. And then your vision. Do you need to modify it, or is it correct? The chances are here that this may need to be modified. And we'll touch on that a little bit more. There's a good chance that these circumstances have changed it enough that you need to rethink that. So with that, what we, especially if you're in something like retail or even your vision of the workplace, that may really need to change. So for a flexible strategy in uncertain times, you need to have products or services that really can address each of these different scenarios. So Mitch talked about this. Things could get worse, things could stay the same, or things could go back to normal. Probably the third one is the one that most people is highly unlikely for some time. It's going to be the first or the second. So you're better off putting your money on the first or the second. I wouldn't put your money on the third one. But whatever it is, you need to think about how your products or services really meet those different scenarios. Now, this, I would think this is worth the price of admission, what you have right here. If you take this and really give it some thought, it's going to really make a difference to your whole strategic planning process. Because what you'll see in your workbook, and I think you're on pages 9, if you're following it, you're on page 9. No, I'm sorry, you're further on than that. I think you're on page 11. My mistake. You're on page 11. So you see this. So what you need to do is you need to fill this out for the 3 different scenarios and use this guide as you fill them out. Now, what you see is on the On the x-axis on the bottom is the cost of growth. The y-axis, the vertical one, is the potential for growth. And so clearly, you should be aiming for the top left-hand quadrant. That's a low cost of growth and high potential for growth. That's where you need to be. That's where you need to be aiming at. But it's really interesting. What was in there before the pandemic hit very probably isn't there anymore. We used to do a lot of live events. Well, that was a lot of our focus. Well, that's not part education. And probably the good thing in education is that the purpose in education now is probably this pandemic is really forcing universities to think more about education and not entertaining on, creating an entertaining campus. So it's forcing people to rethink, where do their deliverables go? And which of these quadrants does it really fit in? Remembering that the likelihood that it's the same as pre-pandemic is pretty low. It's going to be whatever was in the top left-hand quadrant is probably no longer there. It's going to be in one of the other quadrants. And what was in one of the other quadrants is very probably likely to be on the left-hand side, and ideally in the top left. So, for example, we have some clients that are chemical companies. Well, they may be dealing with a product that was in the top left-hand quadrant, but because of the pandemic and the economic impact, it completely disrupted their supply chains. And that has caused an incredible change in the cost structure. And so suddenly now it's moved 2 blocks over on the top row. It's still high potential for growth, but now suddenly this has become a much more costly item. So then you have to rethink, okay, well, how do we compensate for that? What are the ones that we need to be focusing on? Now, this is true when, this is true whatever level you're at. You think about your deliverables. You may be a department servicing other departments in your organization. Think of this in the same way. What are your deliverables that really are going to have the highest value for the people that you are delivering to? So, then from this point, once you've done this, you're ready to set some goals. You've identified for each of these scenarios, you've done your 9-quadrant analysis. And so you've got a plan A, plan B, and, unlikely to get to the plan C, but plan A and plan B. And now you can identify some goals. And so now what we want to figure out is what makes a good goal. Well, you've probably heard of SMART goals. Who hasn't heard of SMART goals? Well, we actually prefer to use power goals. That's what we created, power goals, for a very special reason. SMART goals are very helpful. And I'll actually give you an illustration of it, but there is something about power goals that does make it different. So you probably may have heard of this example, but when President Kennedy gave his famous moon speech in 1961, he said this. He said, "I believe it should be the objective of this nation to land a man on the moon and bring him safely to Earth by the end of the decade." Now that was a SMART goal. It was very specific. It was to land a man on the moon and not leave him up there to die and rot, but bring him back alive, back to Earth. And it was very measurable. You could know that it was exactly the moment he set foot on the moon, they knew that they'd covered the first part. The moment he set foot back on Earth, they knew that they could. It was very measurable. It was agreed to. NASA really bought into that. It was realistic enough. It was an incredible stretch goal, but it was realistic because it actually was based on what a bit technology they'd done coupling in space and stuff like that at that point. So they knew the technology was there, and then it was time specific by the end of the decade. Now that was a pretty powerful goal, except for one thing. It was not tied to a purpose. And the problem was that when NASA completed that, they sat around in a circle and looked at each other and said, okay, what's next? What do we do now? And no one had the answer. They didn't know, they didn't really answer the why they existed. They didn't, were they a military operation? Were they commercial operas? Were they a scientific operation? They didn't know. And that actually hampered NASA from really making the kind of contribution that it could have. Now, we can avoid that by identifying power goals. Many of these are the same elements, but it starts with purpose. Purpose-driven goals. They have to be tied in to the purpose that you have as an organization. And if they don't, then you eliminate them. They're not valid goals. You identify the people, others who are either accountable or the ones who are involved. When by, and then what the end results look like, and is it realistic? So we encourage you to use power goals. Again, that's in your workbook. Remember this, that if you are not clear on the why, you cannot be flexible. It is impossible to have a flexible why. And this is true whether you're running a department, a service center, or an entire organization. If you're not clear on the why, it's going to be very difficult to be flexible. So with that, let me hand it back to Jessica.
Yeah, great, Tony. That was wonderful and always an incredible reminder, especially at a time like this, to build clarity for us as we are looking at flexible strategy. Thank you for that great information. We'll now turn it over to Mitch to round out the rest of the session, starting with talking about the key processes and measurements to be able to accomplish this goal of flexible strategy. Mitch?
Thank you. Yeah, so this is the fifth part. And really, when you think about when you're about to get to this point here, the matrix that Tony took you through, once you've identified those products in your Plan A's and Plan B's, now it's time to come down to making it measurable and actionable. So what we want you to do is, once you get to this point, identify as many of the key processes in your organization. More than likely, there's probably 10, could be less, could be a little more. But what you want to do, identify the key processes that make you, achieve your purpose. These 10 processes that allow you to meet your customer's need. And once you've identified your 10 key processes, you then to also determine who's going to be the person responsible and accountable for that process. There needs to be one. And then next, you need to be sure that you go in and identify those KPIs. As you see, better, faster, cheaper, whatever that may be. How are we going to measure the effectiveness of this process? And so again, just something very simple to do. This idea from this came from Scaling Up, which is Vern Harnish's book. Highly recommend it. Again, it's about accountability and responsibility for the processes and for these actions. And again, it ties back to the power goals as well. Now, you've heard me allude to some books that I think are key. In order that you may think about reading these just in light of where we are in October, I referenced Blue Ocean Strategy. I think that's a great one to start with. Once you've kind of got that, you're in your budgeting cycle, you're doing your planning. Ultimately, Scaling Up by Vern Harnish is a great one. And then once you do that, you've got to make sure that, as we saw, if there's one thing we saw in 2020, we saw those organizations that had a severe lack of leadership. Did we not? So what you want to make sure you do is make sure you're not one of those. And so I would highly recommend Great Leadership by Tony. Amazing book. It's the book that changed when I ran my technology company, it's the book I read that changed my company, and that's why I'm here today. So I just want to highly recommend that one to be key, because you need to have effective leaders to execute. And I know I saw a few of the questions coming through in the beginning about the whole idea of being agile and flexible. Good leaders are agile and flexible. They can adjust in uncertain times. So Tony, I'm gonna let, if you would, go ahead and wrap up. I know we've got a couple of screens and a couple of minutes left, so I'll let you cover this on the wrap up.
Yeah, okay, so just quickly, I think just to reinforce what Mitch said, leadership matters. And it really is, it is the key variable. It's like leaders stand on this kind of the center of a fulcrum, and they tip it over the events that they're going through, either one direction or another. Leadership really does matter. And this is interesting. This is from the same research from KPMG that we quoted earlier. The biggest changes that US CEOs are seeing going forward into 2021, they say this: remote working has caused us to make significant changes in our policies to nurture our culture. The companies that really focus on nurturing their culture are the ones that are really going to come out of this shining and looking really good. And this is a leadership function. You know, we like quoting this guy Eggersheen, who did a lot of research on culture. He made this really interesting statement. He said the unique and essential function of leadership is the manipulation of culture. So culture is a leadership function. And then we will downsize our office spaces, allowing more employees to work remotely. You know, a lot of you are dealing with the challenge of leading people remotely. And again, that becomes fundamentally a leadership issue. And then the next piece of research, which is by Hill Industry, they, again, to reinforce the notion of the importance of leadership, the previous slide was on changes. This is on challenges. Look at this: leader development, culture change, and leading change management. All those leadership functions. So what this really does say is leadership really matters. Everything that we talked about, developing a strategy for your area, that's fundamentally a leadership function. And we did want to, in case you don't know about it, we did want to let you know about the Total Leadership Framework course. It's an 8-hour, and it's got these different elements. It's virtual group learning sessions. There's action planning around it. There are resources. We use assessment instruments to help with self-awareness. We do monthly coaching calls in it. And obviously there's a certificate of completion. So just so you know, if you want to find out more about that, feel free to ask us. With that, Jessica, let me hand it back to you.
Yeah, great, guys. Really great power session on creating a flexible strategy for 2021. Obviously, this is not something that you can plan out in 30 minutes, but at the same time, it is a great way to get a guiding light in the midst of this very uncertain time. And the workbook should definitely help the attendees today. But we do encourage you to reach out to us if you're interested in talking about this more. The website is leaderdevelopmentinc.com. You can email Betsy at ebell@leaderdevelopmentinc.com or the phone number on the screen. And we